What's cracking, guys? Omar Isov here, back with another video. Consider this my last response to the hashtag Natty Verified movement. In case you haven't been watching, Greg O'Gallagher, aka Kinobody, saw fit to start something called the Natty Verified movement, which once and for all was going to expose the fake natties in the lifting community. And you see a fake natural, someone who claims that they're natural, but is indeed not. And so Greg was extolling the virtues of something called the CIR test, the carbon isotope ratio test, which would be able to detect testosterone not naturally produced in the body. And he was saying it was quite reliable. So these individuals that have been claiming for a long time they're natural, we would finally be able to expose them. And I think the intention, once again, taking it at face value, is decent, right? We don't want to be lied to. We want transparency in this industry. It's not regulated at all, so anyone can claim anything. Okay, but I noticed numerous issues with this. I made a video on it, but I didn't want to speak out of my ass. So, as I said in that previous video, I was going to get a researcher, and that's exactly what I got for this video today. Someone who's getting his doctorate on this, on basically anti-doping, steroids, myonuclei, measuring them, anabolism, everything relevant to this video and this discussion on the CIR test, the carbon isotope ratio test. But as I said before, my biggest concern is that this actually could be the greatest gift given to fake naturals, because it's actually not that hard to pass. So these individuals would be able to take this test, even though they're not natural, claim that they're natural, and continue selling their products and claiming something that they're not. And so it's defeating the entire purpose. And in this video, it's an hour long because I want to break everything down. You see, I saw quite a few videos on this topic and I noticed a lot of misinformation. I don't know that much about steroids. I want to make sure we're all on the same page. I want to illuminate this issue and provide, how anti-doping in fact works. So some of that information is very important. And I don't want it just to be a dark, hopeless, because I think the intention once again is solid. The proposal by the researcher that I have in this video, Alex, basically would amount to every influencer contributing about $15,000 roughly. They'd have to work out the details per year in order to do 6 randomized blood and urine tests, and that wouldn't guarantee, and that's what I want to stress. It's more clear than ever before, there is no reliable way of guaranteeing anyone via drug testing currently that they're lifetime natural. It just does not exist, and the best we could hope for is something that's pretty reliable, and it would be pretty damn expensive. But I want to provide some sort of solution. I want to give an in-depth look on this topic. This is my last response because, once again, I've been in this industry now for a damn well over a decade. I care about it a lot. I care about trying to raise the overall fitness IQ. I think this is an important conversation, but I think this pretty much will cover everything that I want to say about the Natty Verified movement. And I'll state once again, for those individuals that are curious in general, yes, because I was mentioning Greg's video, I would 100% take the test anytime, anywhere, a blood and urine sample. But I don't think that for everyone out there, that's going to solve the issue at hand, and we have to look at dishonest marketing as a whole, and I think it's more complex than what we've been talking about. I don't believe in simple solutions for very complex issues. Anyways, if you enjoyed this interview, and there's no fluff you're going to see, it's an hour long for a reason, make sure to like the damn video. And if you want to see Alex talk more about what his research actually entails, also leave a comment and like the video, because I actually find it fascinating, where it deals with myonuclei, it deals with anabolism, it deals with long-term use of steroids, testosterone, the role of hormones in our bodies, just a lot of different issues. I would want to make a separate topic, an educational video on that. So if you want to see that, make sure to like the video, leave that comment, and timestamps are included in the description. Enjoy this conversation. And here we are. I'm joined with a special guest today, Alex, who's getting his doctorate in the steroids. Alex, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of Brighton, working on a research project that is investigating the long-term effects of anabolic steroids on muscle tissue.
Oh, that's mighty convenient. I have to give a huge shout out before we begin to Eric Helms for putting me in contact with you. after I informed him a little bit about the natty verified movement, or the desire for some individuals to try and determine who's natural and who's not, he put me in contact with you. You've been extremely helpful via email, informing me where the current research is. Research papers, actually one with WADA, which we'll get to, that hasn't been published yet, that is actually pretty damn fascinating. And the whole goal with this video today is to try and educate all the listeners as to where anti-doping currently is, what can be done, and what are some of these things that individuals talk about. Because I could tell you, I've been talking with Alex now off camera for the last 20 minutes, and my level of knowledge for this stuff is right down here, where you say anavar, you say tren, testosterone. I could kind of get it, I could kind of can't get it, and I think some people, the way that the natty verified movement has been presented, and I don't mean this in an offensive way, is that it's a solution that is sure to work. And the more that I hear about anti-doping in general, or all these compounds, the more uncertain I personally am. So Alex, first I want to thank you for being on. I want to get in a little bit about your research before we begin and talk about testosterone. Can you just tell some of the viewers what you're actually doing right now?
So we are currently recruiting participants for a research study that is investigating if muscle exhibits a memory of past steroid exposure that may potentially enable past steroid users to retain a performance-enhancing benefit from the drugs they've used in the past, while at the same time just understanding how much muscle people lose when they cycle off anabolic steroids, and further enhancing the literature's knowledge on how they cause an enhanced rate of protein synthesis inside the muscle.
Perfect. And maybe the way that we'll lead off this interview right here would be first for you to explain what exactly are steroids, what is testosterone, or taking super physiological doses of testosterone. What are these things that people talk about when they talk about performance enhancing drugs?
So in the literature, anabolic steroids are referred to anabolic androgenic steroids, or AAS, and that reflects the fact that they have both anabolic, which means muscle building effects, but also androgenic effects, which is the masculinizing, or the effects that cause the secondary sexual characteristics that occur in males after puberty. So that means a deepening of the voice, an increase in hair growth, and those kinds of changes. And testosterone is the principal secreted androgen in men. It's responsible for causing those secondary sexual characteristics in puberty. And from the statistics published by the World Anti-Doping Agency for the past 10 years, the category of drugs most commonly detected in sports have been anabolic steroids. And of the anabolic steroids, testosterone is the most commonly detected. And that's probably a reflection on its availability globally is high and is easily to get a hold of, and the fact that it does indeed work, obviously, in enhancing muscle mass and performance.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about testosterone then. When you said it is the steroid that is most easily identified, it's the one that testing the most individuals has been caught. How does that work? So an individual wants to use, so we naturally, males, females have testosterone. We produce testosterone in our body, but you want to take a super physiological dose, so a dose that's higher than what you normally have in your body. And then how does the anti-doping work? How does an individual try and test for that?
That's a great question. So a fantastic review paper, if you're interested, is The Pharmacology of Anabolic Steroids by Andrew Kickman, as published in 2008. And I'd also recommend a paper that's called The Doping Test Results Dependent on the Genotype of UGT2B17, which is the major enzyme for testosterone glucuronidation, which is a very fancy complex term, but that's what I'll start to describe now. So as you said, males naturally are producing testosterone, females as well, but to a lesser extent. And in most people, it's excreted in the urine in a 1-to-1 ratio to a epimer of testosterone, which is a very similar molecule called epitestosterone. And so most people, when you analyze their urine who are not taking steroids, testosterone to epitestosterone is in a 1-to-1 ratio. If someone takes testosterone exogenously, which means from outside of the body, so that can be done via injections of testosterone that is typically dissolved inside an oil, dissolved and by an ester group being added to the testosterone. So those would be things like testosterone cypionate, propionate, or enanthate. Or someone can also take testosterone exogenously via applying gels, patches, creams, or even a nasal spray. And all of those modes of application are typically used for testosterone replacement therapy, or TRT, and they avoid the requirement for somebody to inject themselves or have a nurse inject themselves if they are receiving TRT. Now, when someone puts exogenous testosterone into their body, it will elevate the testosterone that is produced into their urine. And so the testosterone to epitestosterone ratio will start to increase. And the World Anti-Doping Agency guidelines are, if someone has a testosterone to epitestosterone ratio that is greater than 4:1, then that is flagged as an anomalous result, and that will then further be investigated with the carbon isotope ratio test. It actually used to be 6:1, but now it's currently 4:1. And the carbon ratio isotope test has the ability to determine the source of the carbon inside the testosterone. Has it come from a plant or has it come from a human source? And so what they'll do is, if it's above 4:1, they'll separate out the testosterone from the urine. They'll actually combust it, and then they'll measure the carbon dioxide gas that comes off from that combustion reaction. And they're particularly interested in is it carbon 13 or carbon 12, which is heavy or light carbon inside the testosterone. And basically, carbon that is from testosterone that's applied exogenously has typically come from plants. And so the carbon isotope ratio is the ratio of carbon 12 to carbon 13, has a plant-based signature. Then that means the carbon from that testosterone has come from a plant. You must have taken it from an exogenous source. You must have either injected it or you must have applied a gel, patch, cream, nasal spray, etc. So that is a definitive way of proving if the testosterone found in someone's urine is indeed natural from their own body or it's come from an outside source. So the first thing is find out the testosterone to epitestosterone ratio. Is it above 4:1? If it is, apply the carbon isotope ratio test. Do the carbon isotopes, that's carbon 12 and carbon 13, have a signature that is plant-based, or do they have a signature that is animal-based? If it's plant-based, then you're regarded as testing positive. Now, there's some issue with this test. First issue would be that it's actually genetically dependent on what kind of ratio you excrete testosterone into your urine. So as I said, most people are a 1:1 ratio, but actually the main enzyme that is responsible for the testosterone excretion, there's 2 copies of that gene, and you can either have 2 copies, 1 copy, or no copies. And in the people who have 0 copies of this gene, they actually do not efficiently put testosterone into their urine. And it actually means that their natural ratio of testosterone to epitestosterone can be 0.1 or 0.2 to 1. It's a lot less than 1:1.
Sure.
And so those people, if they then take exogenous testosterone, it will never, or it's unlikely that they will elevate their testosterone above the 4:1 threshold, which can then be used to flag the test that would then do the carbon isotope ratio test, which is the definitive test for proving if the testosterone is plant-based or human-based. Just for example, in one study, 500 milligrams of testosterone enanthate was administered. That's a superphysiological dosage. That was one single intramuscular injection, and 40% of the individuals that lacked 2 copies of the enzyme that was responsible for putting testosterone into the urine never reached the 4:1 cutoff 15 days after the injection. So if those people were subjected to a one-off urine test, their testosterone to epitestosterone ratio would have been below 4:1, so they never would have been subjected to the carbon isotope ratio test. So they would have never actually flagged the software. So that's the first issue with the test. The second issue is that it's theoretically possible that someone could be using testosterone that doesn't have a plant-based signature, and therefore they could be using an animal-based signature. And so even if their ratio is above 4:1, when they're subjected to the carbon isotope ratio test, it might actually work out that their testosterone has the signature of a human and not of a plant. And that would just mean that for some reason their testosterone in their urine is elevated, but we can't seem to see that it was from a plant. So maybe they just excrete above normal levels of testosterone naturally, which does happen to be shown in some people. Although there's no pharmaceutical grade testosterone that is going to have a animal-based signature, it's theoretically possible that someone could create testosterone in the laboratory that has an animal-based carbon signature, and if someone injected that, then the carbon isotope ratio test would not work. But it would be very difficult for someone to get a hold of that. They'd have to have a scientist make that for them. So those are some issues with that test. So what the World Anti-Doping Agency does now is they've realized is that if you have a one-off urine test for somebody and they were below the 4:1 ratio, which means that they won't be subjected to the carbon isotope ratio test, that's not actually good enough, because someone could be doping with testosterone, as we've seen in that research. A 500 milligram testosterone enanthate injection did not elevate some people above the 4:1 cutoff because of their genetics. Then the World Anti-Doping Agency can't use the standard 4:1 cutoff. So what they've decided to do now is actually statistically compare your testosterone to epitestosterone ratio to your previous values. And if, when they compare it to the previous values, there is a big enough discrepancy, then that will flag what the software they are using, which is called the Athlete Biological Passport, to try and say that this person is probably using exogenous testosterone. So for example, let's say this person lacks 2 copies of this gene. They're taking testosterone. Naturally, their ratio is at 0.1 to 1. They take testosterone and it goes up to 0.3 to 1. If we use the 4:1 cutoff that's conventionally being used, they'll never get caught. Yeah. However, their testosterone has trebled in the excretion output in their urine, and the software will say, hang on a minute, that's an anomalous discrepancy, because the ratios are normally, for most people, static through time. They don't vary up and down very much. But if you suddenly go from a 0.1 to a 0.4 ratio and then back down, and they can see that through a timeline by doing multiple urine tests, then that will flag the software and say there's a statistical discrepancy. It wasn't above 4:1. What they will then do is then go into that urine sample, which is then frozen, do the carbon isotope ratio test, and they may well find that there was indeed plant-based testosterone inside that sample, which would then result in that person receiving a sanction. So anti-doping has improved with the idea of comparing testosterone to epitestosterone ratio values to previously collected data points, with the aim to try and catch everybody, no matter what their genetic background is, of how they put testosterone into their urine. And it has definitely improved.
And that's a very good thing. I think I didn't want to be nihilistic at all in my video response to the whole Natty Verified movement. I think if we could come up with a system that truly could detect individuals, it'd be incredible. I think that everyone just has to be aware where the current level of research and where the current level of anti-doping is. Before we go on, as a quick aside, Alex, as I understand it, you've been inspired to pursue your doctorate by watching old Rich Piana videos. Is that accurate?
Well, I remember seeing old Rich Piana videos back in the day where he was talking about his cycles and everything, and it definitely obviously opened my mind to steroid usage, although I knew about it before. But he was obviously incredibly entertaining, and it's a shame he's gone.
Yeah, wouldn't it be, you're going to be a pioneer in the field, and when you list your inspirations like Doctor this person, this person, this person, Rich
Piana.
Yeah.
A special place in my heart.
In your heart forever. And that's what I think. I think it is important, though, to bring everyone on that same page. First, let's dissect then the whole Natty Verified proposal, the efficacy of it in your own personal opinion, where I think the idea is to have the CIR test where people will voluntarily submit themselves to the CIR test, of the carbon isotope ratio test. There would be one test. And initially, I think the proposal, and we'll talk about WADA and why it should be random drug testing, was, everyone does the test, whatever, at X date, cool. And then there'd be a follow-up test. So I think it's and then, in addition to that, which to me doesn't make sense, and we could get into that if you want, is to do a DEXA scan to see their FFMI. Yeah, and then they must be in peak physical condition when they do the test, just to prove that they're able to, that their peak level was attained naturally. But let's isolate the actual testing that's important. I think the CIR. What would the efficacy be to prove someone's lifetime natural, if you were to do a CIR test, so let's say present within the next 2 months, let's say if this thing happens in the next 2 months, and then a follow-up one a year from now, like how effective would that be?
So you definitely wouldn't be able to show they're a lifetime natural.
Yeah.
And this is where it would be vital that the day of the drug test would have to be random and unknown to the person who's wanting to be natty verified. Because, as I've mentioned, when someone takes exogenous testosterone, it will increase their testosterone to epitestosterone ratio. And all they have to do is stop taking testosterone, and their ratio will progressively through time get closer back to normal. And through time, the exogenous testosterone will clear from their urine, and the plant-based signature of that testosterone will be lost. And you could theorize a scenario where someone is using very high superphysiological levels of testosterone via injections, and they're blasting, they're on a steroid cycle. If they wanted to then come off steroids, they could cycle off. It will take a period of time for that testosterone to clear their system, and for their testosterone ratio to go down, and for the plant-based testosterone to go past through their urine. And then after a significant number of months has passed, say 8 or more months, they could then decide that's the day I'm going to have the urine test. And it's highly likely at that point that possibly there's no plant-based testosterone in their urine. So the carbon ratio test is not going to be able to catch them.
Yeah.
They may also, maybe they're deciding to drop down to a replacement dose of testosterone because they might not want to kickstart their own natural production. So they might be using the gels on the patches or the creams. And the clearance rate of those has been shown in the research to be much quicker. And so someone, when they inject testosterone, their ratio is elevated for quite a long period of time. Whereas when they use patches, gels, and creams, it's very transiently elevated. Yeah. So it's likely that if they could revert to using those for a brief period of time, stay off them for a little bit, and then just hope for the best that it's cleared their system. And that's why the best way would be, it has to be random drug testing. Right. And obviously there could be a quack out there who somehow managed to get hold of testosterone that doesn't have a plant-based signature, and right, then they could be getting away with it.
Yeah, if you have enough money, I think a lot of things could be possible. Quick aside before we jump in, where you said the patches, I just want you to explain that, the testosterone patches and the gels. 60 minutes, I'm honestly blanking, and I just want to talk TRT for a second, Alex, because the correspondent, the dude has white hair, he's in his 60s, I'm forgetting what his name is, and he's like, yeah, I'm now on TRT, it's just something he mentioned briefly, and he was interviewing an athlete. This guy's 60 years old. This is an aside, the abuse of some TRT. Alex, this guy's biceps, like I'm going to try and find him and post a photo over here. It's just insane. Like, just talking to some people, the prevalence of individuals going on in their, let's say later 30s, 40s, 50s, and this guy, I think he's in his 60s. Like, dude is jacked, where he just says, yeah, I'm replacing my testosterone. I'm like, you're not replacing your testosterone. You're having more testosterone than you've ever had in your life.
Funny you should say that, because the World Anti-Doping Agency does not allow people to use TRT. Right. So even if you are in an unfortunate incident where you say you get in an accident and you receive some brain damage, your body then might not be sending the hormonal signals to your testes to be making testosterone, and you might have to go on TRT. Yeah. Or naturally, as your age advances and you experience the natural decline in testosterone levels through time, you may have to go on TRT to maintain yourself in the normal physiological range, so that you don't experience the symptoms of low testosterone, of low libido, an increase in fat mass, a decrease in muscle mass, feeling lethargic, and other side effects. But because the potential for abuse, if someone is not getting drug tested regularly, is obviously high, yeah, so they don't allow people to be on testosterone replacement therapy and compete in the sports that adhere to the World Anti-Doping Agency code.
Yeah, which makes complete sense. It's interesting to me how some of those individuals, I'm like, this 6-year-old guy's like, yeah, he probably started with the intention that, his libido was low or whatever, and then wouldn't you know it, like, once again, he's pumping iron and there's just veins on veins on veins. I'm like, get out of here, bro. Alex, let's get into The efficacy, though, of USADA, if you could define first off what USADA is, what WADA is, where recently there's been UFC fighters, I believe they have to adhere to USADA standards, so they sign up. And then also to talk to not make this picture seem so bleak, the weightlifters, right, from a decade ago where they had their urine samples and they're able to detect new, I think it was metabolites. We'll get into that, but how if you have these samples and over time the testing gets better, we can detect these things retroactively. It's just, it's still in the process. But yeah, man, if you could just talk about USADA, WADA.
So the WADA stands for the World Anti-Doping Agency. It was formed in the early 2000s, and it is the global body that conducts anti-doping testing on all of the Olympic-based sports. But other sports that are not in the Olympics can sign up to adhere to the World Anti-Doping Agency Code. And the World Anti-Doping Agency Code is the formal documentation that publishes the list of drugs that are prohibited and also the list of doping practices that are also prohibited. So you'll find online on their website the prohibited list of drugs that includes anabolic steroids, stimulants, growth hormone, EPO, and the such. But there's also a list of practices that are also not allowed, and those would be having intravenous bags of fluid put into your body to help in rehydration, because that can be used to mask steroids and mask blood doping. You can also reinfuse your own blood into your body. That's blood doping. And so there's practices like that which are banned by the World Anti-Doping Agency. The World Anti-Doping Agency is the global governing body, but each country has a national anti-doping agency, or a NADO, and in America the United States Anti-Doping Agency is abbreviated to USADA. And as you mentioned, the UFC as a sport has recently affiliated to USADA, and they are the best anti-doping organization in America. But there are, and the important thing is to note, there's a large number of sports that don't adhere to USADA and the World Anti-Doping Agency Code, the mainstream sports in America. So NFL, NBA, Major League Lacrosse, they don't adhere.
Lacrosse, bro.
So that's an important thing to note. So it's actually a very big step for the UFC to decide to adhere to the USADA program. And athletes that are enrolled in USADA in the UFC program are subjected to the rules of the World Anti-Doping Agency, which are, if an athlete is put on those lists, they have to declare 1 hour every day, 365 days a year, where they could have testers arrive at their house to be drug tested. If they forget to update their whereabouts on the software online and somebody turns up and they don't happen to be there, then they are only given 3 chances. If they miss 3 drug tests because they're not where they say they're going to be, then they will receive an anti-doping rule violation. And you can also receive an anti-doping rule violation if you're caught with prohibited drugs inside your urine or discovered in your blood. And an anti-doping rule violation is at the moment, for a first-time athlete, 4 years. If someone is then caught on a second time, the length of their ban can be customized depending on the severity of the case and how blatant, as you could say, the cheating was. And that can then be anywhere from 8 years to life in some cases. And it is possible for an athlete, if they demonstrate that they inadvertently consumed an anabolic steroid in a contaminated supplement or eating contaminated meat, and it's proven and it's taken to a court that it was indeed not intentional, then the athlete may not receive a 4-year anti-doping rule violation and a 4-year ban. They may only receive a few months to 1 or 2 years. But the important thing is that, and one of the main things that anti-doping and USADA and WADA is based on, is the athlete is 100% responsible for any substance that is found inside their body, irrespective of how it got there. So even if it was true inadvertent doping and someone spiked someone's creatine with some steroids, and genuinely they were not taking them with the intent to cheat or improve their performance, and they didn't know, if it's proven in court, the athlete will still be banned for a period of time because they have to take full responsibility of everything that enters their body.
Sure. Alex, now to ask that $1 million question that I'm sure so many people watching this are wondering, creatine, it's not a drug, right? Because I've been on that shit for 10 years and it feels great. Let me tell you something.
But what I would say is I have seen in research studies that are companies out there that have found to have steroid based compounds or SARMs inside creatine, and that's because some companies might decide to spike the creatine with a banned substance that will cause more of a performance enhancing effect than you'd expect to get with creatine, and that means people then decide to buy that brand more often. So, as a general warning, athletes, particularly those that are going to be involved in any sport that is drug tested under the World Anti-Doping Agency code, they have to be very careful of the supplements they are using. And so they should only purchase supplements that have been third-party verified, which would mean an independent body has gone into that manufacturing facility and they've tested the samples of the supplements to prove that there is no drugs inside there that are on the prohibited list. And those third-party verification include things in the UK like Informed Sport, in America NSF, there are others. But you will have to actually be incredibly careful because the supplements that are tested by those companies, only that lot number is placed and verified by NSF or Informed Sport. So even if you buy that specific company's stuff, you have to go on the NSF or Informed Sport website. You have to see if the lot number of the supplement tub that you have is indeed proven to be clear of contamination, and even that's as good as it can get. But even there, if there's somehow a problem with that and you end up testing positive, you're still going to receive a ban. So the best thing you can do as an athlete, and they actually a recommendation from WADA, is to not use supplements. But if you decide to use supplements, the best thing you can actually do is to use third-party verified supplements.
I guess the next question, Alex, then would be, what is the best available testing that we currently have for endogenous steroids? Would it be WADA, USADA adhering to that where it's randomly tested? Is that the best that we have right now?
Yeah, so if you wanted to catch someone who was doping with endogenous steroids, so that means testosterone or testosterone's precursors, which get converted into testosterone in the body, that would be prohormones, you would have to, number one, collect urine from the athlete on a regular basis.
Yeah.
You would have to see what the testosterone to epitestosterone ratio was. If it was above 4:1, immediately subject that sample to the carbon isotope ratio test to see does that testosterone or its precursors inside that urine have a plant-based signature. If it does, that person has used an exogenous form of steroid. If that person has a low ratio of excretion, that's because of their genetics. You then, in that person in particular, have to monitor them through time, and then you have to use the very sophisticated statistics in the athlete biological passport to compare their values to each other to see if there's a statistical variation, and the sample that has the biggest statistical variation, subject that to the carbon isotope ratio test. But the important thing, Omar, is that this is only for doping with testosterone or its precursors. Yeah. And it's not going to catch somebody who is doping with an exogenous steroid, because although testosterone, although testosterone is the main anabolic steroid, it's been subtly modified so that it can increase its anabolic effects, which is good, that's its muscle building effects, and decrease its androgenic effects, which is its masculinizing side effects. And because there's a need for anabolic steroids in the medical community, because in diseases where people are experiencing muscle wasting and they're bedridden and they can't move, and they might have cancer-associated declines in muscle mass, cachexia, they might have sarcopenia, age-related decline in muscle mass, they may have HIV and muscle wasting because of HIV and AIDS. These people can be given anabolic steroids to increase their muscle mass, which will increase the likelihood that they will be healthy when they leave hospital. Burn victims are another example as well. And so pharmaceutical companies have modified the backbone of testosterone to increase its anabolic activity and decrease its androgenic or masculinizing side effects, so the drugs can be given to women, elderly people, young people, and minimize the side effects. And examples of these exogenous steroids are all forms of oral anabolic steroid, minus the oral version of testosterone. We can ignore that, that's not used very commonly. But in most oral anabolic steroids, of which some of the most commonly detected ones in athletes' urine are dianabol, anavar, winstrol, turinabol. Those have been around for decades now, and they were all originally, with the exception of dianabol and turinabol, but anavar is a good example of one that is used medically in conditions. Now, all of those steroids, when someone takes them orally, they are subjected to degradation by the liver, and the liver will create a large number of metabolites of that steroid, and that metabolite will then get placed inside the urine. And that metabolite is unique to the steroid that has been taken. And so you could call it a diagnostic metabolite. And that metabolite is only going to be found in your body if you have taken some type of that steroid. So a metabolite of turinabol is only going to be found in your body if you've taken turinabol or a close relative of turinabol. So what can be done is that the athlete's urine can be searched for these metabolites which are known, because there's been research studies where they've given these metabolites to research participants, very low dose steroids, to see what metabolites it creates. So athlete's urine is screened for these metabolites. Now, back in the day, we're talking the 1970s, and you can read about this in the Pharmacology of Anabolic Steroids by Andrew Kickman, his review paper. They only ever used to detect the parent compound itself. So they would only look for, say, turinabol inside the urine, and that might only be secreted in your urine for a few days. They then got the ability to detect some of the metabolites that are secreted in your urine that happens to turinabol when it gets broken down by your liver, and those get secreted for an even longer period of time, say a few weeks. Again, this also always depends on how much of the anabolic steroids someone has been taking and for how long. And what's happened with Olympic weightlifting is that in the 2008 and 2012 Olympic Games, the athlete's urine was collected from a large number of Olympic weightlifters, and they were subjected to this screening to try and find the diagnostic metabolites of these oral steroids, which is standard practice. But at that time, they couldn't find any of the known metabolites to science that had been discovered in the research. So none of the athletes were regarded as testing positive. But then in 2013, a new long-term metabolites were discovered for a lot of these oral steroids, particularly winstrol, turinabol, dianabol, and anavar, which are some of the classic ones used to increase muscle mass and performance. And these long-term metabolites are now, they were previously unknown to science, but by analyzing urine samples from people that are known to be taking these drugs, they managed to find these other metabolites that are excreted by over a way longer period of time. We're talking periods of months now. And when they went back into the urine of the people who competed in the 2008-2012 games in Olympic weightlifting, 56 of those individuals were found to have long-term metabolites of these anabolic steroids in their urine that were previously unknown to science at the time of the games. And that meant 56 people had their results disqualified, and it was so bad that in some of the weight classes there were people that were placing ninth getting upgraded to receive a bronze medal. And there were Ilya Ilin is the guy who won a gold medal in 2008 2012, and he was found to have the long-term metabolites of all anabolic steroids in his urine. And so that Olympic weightlifting nearly got kicked out of the Olympics because of it. It's now only a few weeks ago received inclusion for the Paris 2024 Olympic Games. It will be there, but the International Olympic Committee has said that this is their last chance. And if they're observed to have a bad record of doping continuing in the future, they could potentially be dropped and not make it into the Los Angeles 2028 Games. The interesting thing about these long-term metabolites as well is that for oral turinabol, they were actually published in the research and discovered by Gregory Retrenkov, who is the one of the stars in the film Icarus. That is involved in Russian doping. Yep, he is the guy.
Yeah.
He is the main character, the head of the Russian anti-doping laboratory. It's his research that discovered these long-term metabolites, and they've subsequently been validated and verified. A great paper to read if you're interested is a synthesis and structural elucidation of a dihydrochloromethyl testosterone metabolite. That's the chemical name for turinabol. So the long-term metabolites have been discovered and they've been validated, and those are now able to be detected in athletes' urine. So what we can learn from that was that at the time of the 2008 and 2012 games, a lot of these athletes would have been taking oral steroids in the run-up to the games. They all would have stopped at a certain time point. At that time point, they were drug tested. The metabolites that were known to science had cleared from their urine, but the long-term metabolites had not. And then when we go back and look for those long-term metabolites that had only just been discovered to science, they were found to be present, and those athletes have now been sanctioned. And I've been speaking to a few people about this, and they say, well, what is the point in reallocating the medals from an Olympics that happened almost a decade ago, well, more than a decade ago? What does that help? Well, I think it shows to athletes that the detection window for oral anabolic steroids has improved significantly in the past 10 years, and that whatever scheme you were using before and coming off the drugs with enough time for the metabolites to clear your system is not going to work anymore, and you're likely to get caught. So it shows that the detection is improving, and that these exogenous steroids are likely to be detected for long periods of time. One other quite commonly detected steroid that is an injectable is nandrolone decanoate, or decadurabolin. And that creates the same situation. It gets processed by the liver. It creates a unique metabolite called 19-norandrosterone. And essentially, if the amount of that metabolite in your urine is above 2 nanograms per milliliter, that's a nanogram is a billionth of a gram. It's a billionth of a gram. 2 nanograms per milliliter is a tiny, tiny amount. If that's found to go above that threshold, then you have an adverse analytical finding, and you're regarded as testing positive of injecting yourself with nandrolone. And I've seen research for nandrolone, the detection period now, because you can detect down to the nanogram level, billionths of a gram, and in fact we can actually in some cases go down to the picogram level, which is 1,000 times smaller than that. Those metabolites can now last in your urine potentially for years. So that is just a steroid that people should not be taking if they want to cheat, because they're obviously going to get caught. Right. So it's good that this kind of research is being published and that the warnings are being sent to the athletes, because if these sports are genuinely wanting to have a true, clean and fair playing field, as they like to say, the detection has got to be there for as long as is possible.
Yeah, I was going to say, Alex, I really appreciate your perspective, because you're giving the proper framework for this entire conversation of where the research currently is. And again, I don't want it to seem hopeless. There's a lot of progress currently being made. 2 more areas that I want to talk about before I ask you the $1 million question. If you're given all the power to try and determine if someone's lifetime natural, how would you do it? 2 more to talk about then would be, let's talk about HGH, where human growth hormone first. What is it used for? Second, what is that detection window kind of like? We spoke about testosterone, endogenous steroids. We spoke about oral steroids. Now we're talking about HGH. What is it? What's the detection window like? What's the current research on HGH?
So hormone growth. HGH stands for growth hormone, and growth hormone is naturally produced by our body in a pulsatile manner. And athletes they inject growth hormone because it increases muscle protein synthesis. It also enhances fat burning, and it increases the strength of tendons, bones, and connective tissues. Now, the interesting thing, this is where anti-doping science, you can see how difficult this is because when someone takes growth or injects growth hormone, it only has a half-life of about 20 minutes. So that means every 20 minutes, the amount of growth hormone in their blood gets cut by half. So as you can see, that's not much time, and that amount of growth hormone is starting to get removed from their system. And growth hormone is actually not put inside the urine, so it cannot be detectable with a urine test. So at the moment, growth hormone is used is only detectable with a blood test, and there's 2 forms of tests that are involved: the isoform ratio test and the biomarker test. And essentially, growth hormone naturally produced by our body there's lots of different molecular weights of growth hormone, 22 kilodaltons, 15 kilodaltons, 17 kilodaltons. It's all still growth hormone, but it just has a different molecular weight, and there's a whole spectrum of these weights. Growth hormone that is made pharmaceutically, there has been the gene for human growth hormone has been inserted into a bacteria, and that bacteria will then make human growth hormone that then is extracted from that bacteria. And they have only, in most mainstream pharmaceutical companies, it's only going to be producing one growth hormone of one molecular weight, 22 kilodaltons. So if someone injects that growth hormone, the amount of 22 kilodalton growth hormone in their blood is going to go up compared to all the other molecular weights. So they've increased the amount of growth hormone in their body, and it's of a very specific molecular weight. So when you look at the whole spectrum of the molecular weights of growth hormone, the 22 is incredibly up higher. It's upregulated compared to the others. And that test only has around a 24-hour detection window, which is obviously not great, because that means you're going to have to do a blood test to someone the day of or the day after they've injected growth hormone, if that blood is then going to be subjected to the isoform test, as it's called. The second test actually has a detection window of up to 2 weeks. But to put into perspective how difficult this was, it took over a decade of research to get a 24-hour detection window to a 2-week detection window.
Yeah.
And the reason why that's so difficult is because they need to validate that test against people of different genetic backgrounds. So that means different ethnicities, people of different ages, people of different lean body mass, people of different natural growth hormone secretion patterns, people who have just finished exercising, people who have not just finished exercising, to stimulate in and out of competition drug testing. So it's incredibly difficult to try and make a test that is going to work for everybody. But after a decade of research, they managed to get to the point where they improved the detection window to 2 weeks, and that is by looking at the blood circulating concentrations of two proteins that get upregulated after someone takes growth hormone. The first one is IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1, and the second one is collagen 3 N-terminal propeptide, which is abbreviated to P3MP. But essentially, after someone takes a growth hormone injection, IGF-1 and P3MP can be upregulated for 2 weeks compared to a standard population number that they have determined from collecting blood from almost 1,000 athletes now. And so the detection window is indeed much better, but you have to be subjected to a blood test. Blood tests are very expensive, and not every athlete will be subjected to a blood test. But the interesting thing about growth hormone is that in the research, when just growth hormone is given to people, albeit this is with sort of kind of low dose amounts, it doesn't actually seem to be that performance enhancing. It doesn't actually seem to increase strength. It doesn't actually seem to increase performance in various different sport physiological tests. But we definitely know it increases muscle protein synthesis, can enhance fat burning, and increases the strength of tendons, bones, and connective tissues. So some would argue that it's going to potentially increase the recoverability of an athlete, and thereby increase how they can perform and therefore do better, even if it hasn't been spilled out in the research just as yet.
And that brings us maybe to the last topic, or the last PED, which would be something Alex called designer steroids. What are those? It was very interesting where you said the research of Gregory was only able for us to detect certain compounds. What is it? What is a designer steroid, and why are they so hard to detect? Or virtually, in ways, unless you know what they are, they'd be undetectable. We wouldn't be able to know what they are. Yeah.
Yes. So there are methods in place to detect all of the anabolic steroids that have been commercially made by pharmaceutical companies for medical purposes. So all those oral steroids I've mentioned, and all these common bodybuilding drugs, as you could say. However, a designer steroid is a steroid which has been made that is a close derivation of a previously existing steroid, but it's never been taken to market before or potentially be consumed by humans before, which means the World Anti-Doping Agency does not know what diagnostic metabolites it creates in the urine, which is a big problem for science, because that means someone could be taking a substance which is anabolic, it binds to the androgen receptor, it increases the rate of muscle protein synthesis, it's performance enhancing. However, the diagnostic metabolites it creates are totally unknown to science, which means that person would be never test positive if they were taking such drugs. Two very famous examples of designer steroids are norbolethone and tetrahydrogesterone, which is abbreviated to THG, which have been used by athletes who were caught in the Balco scandal, the Bay Area Laboratory Cooperative, which was a scandal in the early 2000s. And Patrick Arnold was involved in the creation of these designer steroids. He was sanctioned and fined, and I believe he even went to jail for this. But one of those steroids, norbolethone, as an example, was first identified in the 1960s, but it was never actually marketed, so it was never used for any therapeutic purposes in humans. And so the unique diagnostic metabolites were not known, so athletes could take that and get away with it. But eventually the information became leaked, and they managed to work out the diagnostic metabolites it created, and they caught people. As that was starting to happen, Patrick Arnold synthesized a steroid that had never been created before, and he combined trenbolone and destrenone to create tetrahydrogesterone, THG, and THG had never been created before, as far as we know, and it had never been used in humans, and he called that the clear, and these athletes would drop in a THG underneath their tongue. It would go straight into their lymphatic system, and that's how they would end up taking the drug. It wasn't an injectable or an oral, and essentially by making the structural modifications in these brand new steroids, it created metabolites that had never been known to science before. So I'll just read a little abstract here from the paper where it says, tetrahydrogesterone had never been synthesized, documented, or marketed by any pharmaceutical company or known laboratory. It was a brand new chemical entity. Many have called it the first true designer steroid, as norbolethone was previously known. It was created with the dual purpose of imparting anabolic effects to athletes and allowing those athletes to avoid detection by standing doping control. The primary reason why THG was undetected is that it tended to break down by the prepared analysis used in doping control, and this certainly was no accident, but a conspiracy involving chemists, coaches, and athletes to develop a new and undetectable designer steroid to defraud their fellow competitors and the world public. The THG scandal shows that there is the technology at the disposal of scientists performing drug schemes that can specifically create a drug that can indeed avoid detection. If there's one lesson we've learned from THG, is there's the potential of other non-detectable anabolic steroids that are in the pipeline or could currently be used. So tetrahydrogesterone, it got broken down into these metabolites that no one ever had seen before. And the only way that we managed to unravel this, well, the only way the United States Anti-Doping Agency unraveled the scandal was somebody sent a syringe that contained THG to their laboratories. They then gave it to baboons. The baboons created metabolites that they had not seen before. They were not in the control baboons. They then looked in human urine to find those metabolites, and ta-da, they found the metabolites of THG inside numerous Olympic athletes, Dwayne Chambers, Marion Jones, and people that had won Olympic gold medals. So a carbon isotope ratio test is not going to detect a designer steroid. In fact, no drug test is going to detect a designer steroid. And so all you will need, and Patrick Arnold has been on the Tim Ferriss podcast. If you were really interested in designer steroids, I'd listen to that episode, and you'll realize that with relative ease, somebody with what they say in this paper of only $50,000 to $100,000 worth of laboratory equipment could actually design a brand new designer steroid not known to science, give it to athletes. And this is where it gets incredibly risky, is that because it's never been tested on humans, cells, mice, or anything, we have no idea what the side effects could be. And the side effects from THG in some athletes, particularly women, they lost their menstrual cycle, their hair started to fall out, they got acne, they experienced hair growth all over their body, and were basically becoming masculinized at a rate that they had no idea the speed of, because the drug had never been given to people before. So designer steroids can be used by athletes. They're undetectable, but those athletes have to be very, very careful that they do not that they're taking something that's never been tested for its efficacy or safety.
Wow, that I like how you said with $50,000, $100,000 worth of lab equipment, where it's not an exorbitant. I was thinking, it's a multi-million dollar. You need to get the facilities and to do all these things. Kind of shows you that and maybe before we talk about how you'd approach the Natty Verified movement, what your proposal would be. Just the current state of research of anti-doping and the funding. We're talking off camera about this, where obviously these countries, these sports, so the NFL, I'm not saying that they're complicit in what's going on, but it's millions and millions, if not billions of dollars. But the amount of funding that anti-doping gets, at universities is not that large, right? It's not like WADA, its total budget in order to detect these things. It's not that great.
I mean, if just the WADA budget, as they've obviously have to publish this information, and it is $32 million. Is basically what it is.
Yeah.
So you've got one single organization that only has a budget of $32 million that's responsible for the drug testing and athlete whereabouts and coordination of anti-doping for every single Olympic sport and the other sports that want to adhere to the program.
Yeah.
And you have to bear in mind that although the UFC have signed up to the USADA program, that is an extreme cost to them. Yeah. They are the ones that are paying for that, because they believe it is the gold standard in America for drug testing. And they are paying for hiring the doping control officers to go out there and drug test the people, because obviously you can't have your friend collect your urine, because that's subjected to some serious manipulations. Oh, I should say as well about the whole Natty Verified thing is this is another reason why you can't have this is about who. Well, we'll talk about that in a second. I'll tell you a funny story. So the question you're asking is, yes, WADA is fundamentally budget is very little for the global task they have to try and achieve, and the only way that somebody is going to be able to get drug tested regularly might have to be they end up paying themselves to do it.
Right. And that's maybe with everything we talked about over the last hour, now that people have been informed way more than they previously thought they probably could be, which is good, enabling people with this level of knowledge, where I think trying to give people overly simplistic solutions to complex problems is not the answer. Let's now dissect. You're going to talk about the whole Natty Verified movement. You're going to tell me a funny story. I want you then after to tell me best case scenario, like, Alex, somehow we did it, dude. We raised $10 million or whatever. We have the budget. How would you go about it? And then 2, what is the most practical, feasible way moving forward, if there is one at all? So, what are your thoughts?
So the immediate problems with people just doing one-off drug tests to prove their natty status are, first off is there's no guarantee that the urine sample that they donate is their own. You have to have somebody, and this is the way it is with all drug-tested sports, is somebody has to go to the athlete's house or gym or agreed location, and that's why they have to declare their whereabouts for 1 hour every day, 365 days a year, is there is a location which the doping control officer can turn up, and they have to watch the athlete urinate in a bottle. I mean, that's kind of humiliating. Yeah. Back in the day, that was not the case, and Mike Tyson has said in his autobiography that he had a fake penis called the Wizinator, yep, which he had filled with urine from someone that was in his entourage that they knew was drug-free, and he quite simply would just dispense the urine from the Wizinator into the bottle, and even though he was taking performance-enhancing drugs and smoking marijuana and cocaine and the other things which he admits to in his autobiography, at that time, he never tested positive. So you cannot just take their word for it that they've sent their urine off. There has to be a doping control officer turning up. As we've all mentioned previously, there has to be a random time That cannot be a convenient time that is convenient for someone in terms of them saying, this is the date I want you to arrive. It can't be like that. It has to be at a random date, because they could be drug free for a year and then they might hedge their bets and assume that actually my testosterone ratio has probably dropped down by now. I'm not taking any exogenous testosterone, haven't taken oral steroids for 2 years. I could get away with that.
Right.
I reckon I could hedge my bets, and I'm not taking growth hormone at the moment. I'm only going to have a urine test. They might want to hedge their bets if they haven't been on steroids for a few years, that they could pass a urine test with the clearance windows. If somebody was on oral steroids or using testosterone, and that had only been a few months ago, it'd probably be highly likely that you'd be able to catch them.
Yeah.
But as we said, there's still, that might not always be the case. So that's important. And the only way this would ever really work is that you'd have to have fitness influencers somehow sign up to. The thing is also, we're only talking about USADA, but I mean, there's fitness influencers that don't live in America. They'd have to sign up to their national anti-doping agency. They would have to register. They'd have to declare their whereabouts for 1 hour every day, 365 days a year. They'd have to be subjected to both urine and blood testing, and you would have to drug test the athlete regularly. That would be the biggest thing, is that you can't just rely off 1 or 2 random drug tests here or there. Right. You'd want to have a series of drug tests over a period of years that showed their testosterone ratio was never elevated above 4:1. They were subjected to the carbon isotope ratio test randomly here and there, which is not the norm. They'd have to go over 4:1 for that to take place in the first place. There was never any presence of oral steroids in their urine. And if you were drug testing someone in their urine every couple of months, then that would be pretty damn good. Yeah. But again, that'd have to be at a random time. And I can't see any national anti-doping agency accepting fitness influencers to register for them unless the fitness influencer is directly giving them the money to drug test them. Right. That would be the only way it would happen. And this is expensive. In the UK, you're looking at around £500 to £600 for a urine test. A blood test is probably double that. And with blood, you also then have to put the blood on ice. Its temperature has to be monitored the whole time when it then gets its way to the laboratory, because if there's a significant decrease or increase in temperature, it might invalidate the blood and result in the inability for it to be used for drug testing purposes. So the temperature has to be monitored the whole time on the blood. So you're going to be paying for the shipping as well. You're going to have to be paying for all these kinds of things. So if a fitness influencer was really interested in it, I guess what they could do is somehow, I don't even know how they would go about it, register themselves with the National Anti-Doping Agency, say, I want to be drug tested at a random date every 2 months, blood and urine. Yeah. And even at that point, the best, if that happened, the best thing you'd know is that, okay, well, if and all the other things of anti-doping were adhered to. So you had an anti-doping officer go there that they didn't know, and their blood was taken correctly, urine taken correctly, shipped and stored correctly. You definitely know that they can't be using oral steroids, because the metabolites, if you're testing them every 2 months, would definitely show up. You definitely would know that they're very unlikely that they'll be using injectable testosterone, because at some point in the 2-month period, their ratio would get elevated. Even if they were using patches, gels and creams, that only really is used in TRT level dosages, so it's not going to be super performance enhancing, but even then you'd still expect them to get caught, because they'd be taking that on a daily basis or using those on a daily basis, and so their ratio should get upregulated, and there should at some point, if they were subjected to a carbon isotope ratio test on the monthly basis, be the presence of plant-based testosterone. So if we had $1 million budget, I guess you'd have to have it as a voluntary thing, where you'd say, right, you sign up to this, you pay yourself, and you can imagine that's a hell of a lot of money. Yeah. And you get drug tested every 2 months, which I would add is probably more than some athletes are getting tested sports, Olympic level sports. And then you'd be able to prove you're natty verified, at least for that time period. Who knows what you did years ago. Yeah. And then also the question then is, are you going to do that for your whole life? Yeah. And also, what if you decide to stop doing that? What if your budget gets low, and then that's the reason why you stop doing it, and then everyone says, no way, bro. Yeah. The reason why you stop doing it is because you decided to go on a cycle or something.
I did a quick I did a quick calculation in my head where you said every 2 months, so that's 6 times, and you said it's about five. You said 500 pounds, which is even more U.S. and then I'm Canadian dollars, but $500 about for a urine sample. Double that, so let's say $1,000 for blood. So that's $1,500 every single time, and then you're doing it, 6 times. So we're adding that up. It's 9,000 pounds for one individual for 1 year. Which would be probably like 12 to 13,000 US dollars. Probably honestly closer to like $16,000 Canadian. And that even, and I think you made a perfect distinction. That wouldn't be drug free. That would mean that you're drug tested, and with those tests, you're verified that all the compounds that they test for, you were not found using it. So it's not even, and yeah.
They could well be using growth hormone.
Yeah.
Because you'd have to be tested on a 2-weekly basis to prove your growth hormone. Or if they're using the other test, if the lab you're local to doesn't have access to it a daily basis, no one's going to be doing that. But then again, growth hormone is not necessarily performance enhancing by itself,
Right.
but still. So, or you could just the whole time be taking a designer steroid that someone has made for you, and you could get away with it all, even if you're paying all that money. And that would be the ultimate conspiracy style fake natty would be sign up, pay for all your drug testing all the time, but take a designer steroid, and then no one knows. So it's way too expensive. I don't even think an anti-doping, it would have to be like there would have to be some sort of central governing body, call it the Fitness Anti-Doping Agency,
Right.
or FADA or something like that. And all the influencers would have to give their money to that. Maybe there'll be like an annual subscription fee.
And then grand.
Yeah, exactly, of an obscene amount of money. And then FADA would then you'd have to adhere to the WADA code, so you'd have to supply 1 hour every single day for 365 days a year could be drug tested. You'd have to accept people coming into your house to watch you urinate all the time. You'd have to accept that you can't use certain supplements that other athletes can use. You'd have to accept that if you wanted to take any medications which could potentially be banned, you'd have to file it with a doctor to prove that the only reason why you're taking those medications is for a genuine medical requirement, that your health is going to deteriorate without them and not because you're trying to cheat. Yep. If you got in some sort of accident and you had to go on TRT, or your natural testosterone started to decline, that's it, you're off the team. So that's a problem. And so all in all, I think if you truly wanted to prove someone is drug-free, you'd have to drug test them very, very regularly in the case of the fitness industry, at the expense of that person. I can't see most people wanting to do that. And also, Omar, you've got to think about how much of a benefit is that going to give to that person, right, if they drug test them all the time. Is it really going to be an investment that them being natty verified with that setup is then actually going to make them more money, right, give them more followers? Or is it just some sort of like badge of, yes, I get drug tested every 2 months, so all those standard compounds I can't be using. I could still be taking growth hormone or designer steroids, but that's the same for all athletes. But I don't see how most people are then going to suddenly flock to that person to then buy more of their products or take more of their word for it, because enhanced and non-enhanced people, there's people out there who give good advice and have followings anyway.
But I think you're forgetting one key factor, Alex, and that is when you do all this, you pay the 15 grand, you get the hashtag Natty Verified on your IG bio, and that's worth the money alone, bro. on your forehead. Yeah. Now, one final subject to talk about that I found fascinating that you linked to me, and I appreciate how thorough you are. It has not been published yet. I don't want to misspeak here, but it's from WADA, and it has to deal with muscle biopsies and detecting the presence of someone that used PEDs, performance enhancing drugs, over 10 years previously. Can you just talk about where that is and what this is kind of like cutting edge, like what's next when it comes to doping? WADA is moving with a $32 million budget. This sounds cool. What is it?
So the name of the paper that is on the WADA website, you can just Google this and you'll find it for yourself. It says skeletal muscle proteome alterations after long-term anabolic steroid abuse, as published by Malm. I'll just read the conclusion for you because it's not particularly long. Our laboratory has demonstrated changes in the muscle cell after anabolic steroid abuse more than 10 years after the cessation of intake. Using proteomics, we can detect 2,300 individual proteins inside muscle tissue, and more than 80 of these proteins are changed by using banned substances. So this is just a one-off paper that's put on the website. This hasn't been, as far as I'm aware, published in the scientific literature, so it hasn't been peer-reviewed. But it is suggesting that if somebody had a muscle biopsy, there may be the ability to detect the anabolic steroid use from 10 years ago by the proteins in their muscle actually being different. I can obviously, Omar, go in a lot more detail with this, and maybe we will do that in another conversation of potentially the long-term effects of anabolic steroids.
Yes.
But if this would be as far as we know in the research, the longest detection window that we have is 10 years, and you'd have to have a muscle biopsy. That's not The World Anti-Doping Agency does not muscle biopsy athletes to try and prove their steroid usage. There's no way that would ever be allowed because that's an invasive procedure. It's only ever used in research purposes. But these research team has happened to show that there is potentially long-term altercations inside the muscle fibers 10 years after someone taking steroids, and that might be the only way you can potentially prove someone is a lifetime natural. As I've mentioned, it seems to be for the standard urine tests, the best you've got is potentially 2 years with nandrolone. So this is the longest detection window I've seen in the scientific literature for anabolic steroids, but it only is involved with the muscle biopsy. The muscle biopsy is then preserved in a reagent that protects the proteins. The proteins are then looked at, and then if they're compared to be similar to this group of past steroid users compared to control groups, then you could say, that person has been taking steroids. But the caveat to this research is that as far as I'm aware, there was only 7 or so past anabolic steroid users. So the sample size was particularly small, which is problematic because we might not necessarily know if the reason why those proteins were different in those past steroid users was because of the steroids or just because they all, for some reason, that was the case. So they actually only had 7 past steroid users in this research. So that's the longest detection window I've ever seen. It's not true lifetime verification, but it's the best you'd get. And I can't ever see fitness influencers necessarily wanting to sign up for muscle biopsies. You never know, they might want to for research, but that's not going to be an anti-doping agency that's going to be doing that. That would have to be a university and a research organization that would have to be doing that, and that would have to undergo the ethical procedures of the university, deeming whether or not the level of risk associated with the muscle biopsy is acceptable for what the proposed outcome would be. So there would be difficulties in somebody trying to prove their 10-year natty verification with a muscle biopsy, and that out of all of them would probably be the most expensive way of doing it, because you'd have to get yourself to the university, have the medical staff time, the way it'd be preserved, and then paying for that type of analysis.
Now, with that being said, you approach the university. It's like, okay, hi, how can I help you? It's like, I want to be #natty verified. It's like, you understand we're doing cancer research on curing AIDS, and these muscle biopsies are incredibly expensive, and we have limited resources, and we're using them to try and, solve the big world problems. And someone's like, but yeah, bro, I got to be natty verified. Like, give it to me. I got a final question for you, Alex. You've been super informative this entire hour. How do we know you're not a plant by big creatine, and that you're not natty verified, and you're just scared of doing this test, and you're just making all this up? How do we know that you're not on creatine right here, right now, doing this entire hour-long interview? You said you watched Rich Piana before.
I know. I have taken creatine in the past, Omar, actually.
Wow.
Quite a few times.
Oh no.
For months on end, actually. I didn't notice that big of a difference, so maybe it was bunk. I don't know.
Yeah. I guess we're omitting things, Alex. I'm a lifetime user of creatine myself. So.
Lifetime.
Since I was weaned on it from when I was a young lad. Yeah, just in the milk.
I bet you were hoping some of it was contaminated with steroids as well. Yeah, that's the true good creatine.
Yeah, it's not produced the effects I had hoped, but I'm still hopeful. I think I just got to keep taking it. Alex, I want to thank you so much for doing this video and illuminating everyone. I want you now to have the opportunity, because you're doing really cool research, and I think everyone listening to this video, if you want to see not necessarily a sequel, but what Alex's research is more related to, which is the long-term effects of steroid use, and taking a look at things that, once again, are at the cutting edge, make sure to like this video and leave a comment below. But you can actually help Alex out right now with his research, and this would just improve the overall fitness IQ and how we understand all these things. Alex, can you just tell us a little bit about that?
So we're recruiting participants at the moment, males that are aged 20 to 35, who are currently using anabolic steroids. When they come to our laboratories, we ideally sample them just after they've taken steroids, and then they return to our laboratories 20 weeks later. And at that 20-week point, they have not been exposed to any super physiological levels of steroids anymore. So we can monitor what happens when somebody cycles off anabolic steroids, and does their muscle remember that steroid exposure. And we're also looking to recruit guys who previously used anabolic steroids 2 to 4 years ago, but since then have been drug-free. Again, we kind of want to build on this research that shows there seems to be some lingering long-term effects of anabolic steroids inside the muscle. And maybe in the next video, Omar, we can talk about how that's been demonstrated in mice, but we don't know in humans if there is a long-term benefit to steroid exposure years after you've stopped, or even after a short period of time after you've stopped. So if there's anyone out there who's just planning on concluding a steroid cycle in 2019, then you can email me at a.colliari-turner@brighton.ac.uk or akt19@brighton.ac.uk. Omar put the email below. If you live anywhere in Europe, come and get in touch with me, and we can try and work out reimbursing your travel expenses. And particularly if you're a current user who's planning on finishing their steroid cycle, because we have sampling in June, August, September, and October, or if you're someone who used to take steroids and you're interested in sort of contributing to the research that's trying to work out if there's a memory in your muscle of that past steroid exposure, then come and get in touch with me.
Amazing. Alex, do you want to shout out anything? Do you have an you have something to promote that you could shout out? You just gave an hour of your time. Yeah.
Just a research study. If anybody out there would like to share the advert, because I think what I've described is interesting, particularly Omar, when we maybe talk about it later. I have an Instagram account that has just one post on it for the advert to be shared. It's Alex_K_T. That's the only information on there. You can find out more of the study there. You could also search Alex KT Muscle Memory on Facebook, and you'll find some public posts. Take a read of the research, what we're trying to do, share it. That would be incredibly helpful to me, because so far the current and the past users we've recruited have come through social media. Yeah. And if anyone is interested that lives in Europe, male, age 20 to 35, please do come and get in touch with me.
Amazing. Alex, I just want to say thank you so much for being on the channel, for sharing all this information. For everyone watching this video, hopefully you learned a hell of a lot. We, of course, included those timestamps for a reason in the description. And like we said, there will be a follow-up video. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like the damn video. And I'll see all you guys, my rascals, in that next one. Peace.